And I think that the people in this part of the world would do well to listen to Dr. Martin Luther King and give him what he's asking for and give it to him fast before some other factions come along and try to do it another way.
He exposed deep social and racial flaws and helped usher in a new America, one that appreciates the lives and contributions of women and minorities. Though he rarely traveled to the southwestern U.S., Dr. King's unforgettable words of hope and love were as legendary and compelling in New Mexico and Arizona as in his home state of Georgia.
Are you afraid?
No, I'm not. My attitude is that this is a great cause, it is a great issue that we are confronted with, and I have always felt that ultimately along the way of life, an individual must stand up and be counted and be willing to face the consequences, whatever they are. And if he is filled with fear, he cannot do it.
The Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Center of the New Mexico Holocaust and Intolerance Museum seeks to honor Dr. King's legacy and messages of tolerance, hope, and inclusiveness for all races and religions. The center will be housed in the historic Rosenwald building on Albuquerque's Central Avenue. The facility, already acquired, will be unique in that it also will house the New Mexico Holocaust and Intolerance Museum, the African American Museum and Cultural Center of New Mexico, and the New Mexico Human Rights Coalition Education Fund.
Yesterday was a victory.
In addition to the words and images of Dr. King, a number of those who marched and strategized were arrested and beaten with him, as well as individuals who toiled behind the scenes for human dignity and civil rights will be featured in the center. These include Dr. Joseph Lowery, who co-founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with Dr. King, Reverend Jesse Jackson, a protege who was with Dr. King the night of his assassination, congressional representatives Eleanor Holmes Norton and John Lewis, former members of Robert F. Kennedy's Civil Rights Division, John Doerr, Brian and Dorothy Landsberg, Steve Pollack, and federal judge Thelton Henderson, former politicians Julian Bond and Walter Fauntroy, Dr. King's assistant Zernona Clayton, and actress Nichelle Nichols, who soared to international acclaim as Lieutenant Uhura in the hit series Star Trek. Also featured will be Morris Dees and Joe Levin, two individuals who carry on the struggle for justice and equality today through the internationally recognized Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama. Dr. King's message of peaceful resistance, rooted in his love of God and church, touched the hearts and souls of not only Americans, but people around the world.
The black church has always preached love. We've always preached from a theology that despised the sin, but loved the sinner, have goodwill, agape, the sinner. And so we didn't teach hate. We didn't teach violence. And in the struggle that began in the 50s, under the leadership of Martin Luther King and others, we taught nonviolence, and we taught turn the other cheek. We taught that the moral forces of the universe were on our side because we adopted the methodology that was advocated by the moral forces of the universe, and that was nonviolence. Jesus said, man smites you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. And of course what he meant was if someone does you an evil deed, you don't give an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but you do good for evil. And in the end, you help redeem the whole process. You help redeem the people who initially had been persecuting you. And that was the power of the movement. And people with consciences were touched by the movement. And they saw these people who were persecuted returning good for evil, refusing to shoot back, refusing to bomb churches and homes, but to literally turn the other cheek and continue to be nonviolent.
The government was being used
as an instrument of great evil. On the other hand, I think that the movement, that the history reflects that the government can be a source of great good, and we could not have changed the racial caste system in the South without a strong federal law enforcement effort, and without courageous judges like Judge Frank Johnson and the judges of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal who did enforce the law. So I think you can see I think people ought to understand the ability of the government, both as a force of evil and as a force to bring about positive change.
They also provided rare glimpses into Dr. King away from the media spotlight.
He preached nonviolence, and he practiced it. And I saw that preachment and that practice. I've been in his presence where a man walked up to him, a well-groomed white man, and somehow we're conditioned to think that if people look okay, they are okay. This white man, to just cite you an example, walked up to him, suit and tie, looking like a banker, and asked, "Are you Martin Luther King?" And he said, "Of course, yes." He just raised his hand back and slapped him upside the head and knocked him down. Now there I was. I'm 4'11", and I wanted to take this 6-foot man, take him on. Dr. King reminded me that I was too little to beat anybody up and that I was forced to be nonviolent. He got up, brushed himself off, calmly said to us standing by, "Acts like this remind us there's a lot of work still to be done."
I think his strongest attribute was, well, a couple of things. One was his ability to speak to blacks and whites in the common language of Christianity. And doesn't mean he couldn't speak to Jews or Muslims or non-Christians, but he spoke to Americans in a common language that both of them could understand.
After the first year or season of Star Trek, I wanted to go back to my first love, which is musical theater. Character Dr. King said, "What you talking about?" My shoulder goes. He said, what he really said was, "You can't." And I said nothing, just looked at him. He said, "Do you realize for the first time, we are being seen, will be seen all over the world as we should be seen, as not only beautiful people who can sing and dance and tap dance, or wonderful people who can play maid roles and subservient figures, but of people of quality who have PhDs, who their lives mean much more than second rate." He went on to say many other things, and then he looked at me and said, "And besides, you can't leave. You're on a 5-year mission and you're fourth in command."
These individuals, who survived one of the most turbulent eras in American history, also acknowledge that Albuquerque, one of America's most diverse cities, is the appropriate location for a center that celebrates inclusion and diversity.
Why do I think Albuquerque would be a good place to have a memorial for Dr. King? I think it's quite appropriate, and I think it's because Dr. King affected more than Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. King affected more than Birmingham and Selma. He affected the entire country, and I would be so bold as to say the entire world, in the same ways that Gandhi affected the thinking of the world. And so it's quite appropriate that people, and particularly children in Albuquerque, and even perhaps children in Boise or children in New Haven, not have to go to Atlanta to see and touch and feel all the things that Dr. King stood for.
The Albuquerque is a good place, and we've got to be careful in this spreading diversity, that we don't let ourselves be manipulated and turn on each other rather than to each other. That's very important. So I'm glad Albuquerque has a thoughtful and visionary leadership at this museum that wants to make this kind of educational entity available to their people. I say thank God for you, museum.
That's why New Mexico has an interest, because New Mexico, people have been fighting from the time you divided Mexico from New Mexico. The struggle never really stopped. So we must now broadly define a one big tent for human rights, and Dr. King was a pivotal figure in that, but not the only one. It was Dr. King, to be sure. Chavez, to be sure. And I would like to think that the more we have a museum in New Mexico, you can appreciate just how all of us have struggled for human rights and to make America better and the world more secure.
Well, I think it's important for there to be a center in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, honoring Martin Luther King Jr., because Martin Luther King Jr. message is universal. It's not just a message for African America, but it's a message to all human beings that dwell on this little planet we call Earth.
While we Americans have some sense of the black civil rights movement, we have almost no sense of the Chicano movement, of the Native American movement. We have almost no sense that these people struggled and fought and won.
In addition to the words and images of Dr. King and others involved in the struggle, plans call for interactive kiosks where visitors can view images of violence against blacks, whites, and others, and type in anonymous responses. Some responses will become part of the exhibit. There also will be wall space for artwork and essays by Albuquerque area youngsters with the theme of inclusiveness and tolerance. Ultimately, all the images and words are designed to serve as educational tools to promote and spread Dr. King's profound, prophetic messages of love, diversity, and above all, tolerance.
Glory, hallelujah! Glory, hallelujah! His truth is marching on.